Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Scaling Alpha podcast. Today, I'm joined by Nate Slemp, founder and chief investment officer of BT Management and the leader behind his consulting firm, BTC Strategy. Nate has built a fascinating career that bridges the physical reality of large-scale infrastructure deployment with the analytical world of macro strategy. He transitioned from building custom hardware servers and scaling a 6 megawatt industrial operation to establishing both a fund framework driven by his core execution models and dedicated advisory practice. Across both of these ventures, his ultimate objective is educational, helping people unpack and truly understand the structural mechanics of Bitcoin. Nate, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Really excited to have you here today. Why don't we just start to give kind of the viewers a grounding? Tell us about your background. Like, where'd you go to school and what was kind of the first, place you worked coming out of your education?
Sure. I grew up on a farm, ended up going to Virginia Tech, founded a tech company, and that got funded. I actually
What
ended up dropping out to focus on that
what was the name of that
and
company?
Virtual U.
Got it.
And it was a company based on triangulated photogrammetry.
Hmm.
And that was a really good experience. I learned a lot from that.
Tell us a little bit more about what that is.
Sure. So it sounds like a lot, but it's not. And bear in mind, this was a long time ago where this was kind of a, I don't know, semi interesting thing. Now it's not so much anymore. But triangulated photogrammetry is the idea that if you have a camera here and a subject here, you don't know the distance between here. But if you have something in the background, you know the distance from the camera to the background. So you've got a known. And then all it takes is stitching two cameras to basically generate a 3D model of something. And at the time, photogrammetry rigs were like $250,000 outfits, and they were very specific and niche, mostly used for movie studios and like games and stuff. And I ended up building a system that arguably worked better for about 20 grand. And
Oh, wow.
that was kind of the backbone of that business.
What did you learn there that you think potentially brought that could, translates to what you're doing now?
Sure. So on the tech side, I learned a ton, but also I kind of learned market incentives and how I guess some things can be misaligned when investment starts coming in. And I don't know, it'd take a while to really dig deeply there, but I think I learned a lot of invaluable lessons from it. So
So where did you go after that?
I ended up working for a bunch of different startups. I basically focus on building infrastructure for brand new companies on the hardware side. So there was a lot of short gigs where I would come in at the beginning, and I moved around a lot. I think in 15 years, I've lived in 14 cities. And, uh,
Fantastic. That
and
must be a
so,
great experience as well.
yeah, it was awesome. But then interestingly, kind of what I was doing more or less got put out of business by AWS. So that's when a buddy told me that I should focus on Bitcoin mining. And that's really when I got into taking that seriously. And admittedly, there was a pretty long period of time where I did it as a hobby, but then eventually turned it into my full focus and then focused on that for close to a decade.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of experience to building kind of, operational infrastructure, right? And trying to maximize whatever the outputs that you are trying to maximize against cost and what have you. It sounds like you did that for, industrial mining operation. You probably did it for other clients as well. Tell us a little bit about that and how actually it translates to what you were doing with Bitcoin mining.
Sure. So, admittedly, kind of in the Wild West days of startups, especially tech startups, it was frothy, and I will confess that a lot of times the budgets weren't cost conscientious, but
Hmm.
AWS kind of forced that in the marketplace. So that's when a lot of the margin got cut out. Bitcoin mining is has followed an interesting similar path. I mean, it's gone through like phases where towards the beginning, if you just knew anything about Bitcoin, you had a huge enough lead where you could do it and be competitive. And then it really kind of transitioned into scale,
Hmm.
leveraging scale.
And the
And
arbitrage was, at least for the smaller players, it must have been hedged out.
But what's really interesting is as this keeps developing, the best way I can describe this is scale works to a point. And so it's gotten to the point where mining operations have grown so large that they don't really fit inside the existing grid in a way that's cohesive and makes sense. And
Okay.
so there's scale's great until it's not. And in my opinion, the industry kind of overshot that. And now a lot of the margin is being found in smaller pockets that are highly efficient. And I think that's really interesting. And I think there's eventually going to be a push even further in that direction. That's really exciting. But I don't know. It's funny how a lot of things operate on cycles and you see these things go back and forth. And
Explain what you mean by scales works till it doesn't. And obviously, specifically in Bitcoin mining, when does it stop working?
yeah. So I think the easiest way to do it is look at what we did. So the mining operation that I set up for myself was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the city of Chattanooga was consuming approximately 400 megawatts on peak load and then about 120 megawatts at the very lowest point. And so there was about a 280 megawatt gap. And EPB orders blocks of power. And so basically, they're ordering slightly more than 400 megawatts to meet peak load. And when it's not peak hours, a lot of that load goes to waste.
Mm,
And that's basically, it kind of has to function that way because if you don't have that overage, then you have blackouts. And
yep.
so my mining operation actually got a grant from the government, and we might be the only one
Hmm.
to basically do peak load shaving, which is what really big consumers do. I mean, it's not exactly a new thing, but I'm pretty confident I was one of the first people to do it in Bitcoin mining.
Mm.
And it ended up being a very good experience and made us incredibly competitive.
So peak load shaving, does that mean that you explain that? Like I'm sure you're capturing
Sorry.
some portion of that load that's going to you, but put it into terms that us laymen can understand.
Yeah, I apologize. So
No worries. This is fascinating. I want to know the lingo. So, and I'm sure our viewers would want to know the lingo in case they come across it again and they're going to understand it.
sure. So basically, the idea of peak load shaving is that you're trying to not add load at the top end to increase the peak load, and you're turning off, and then you're only consuming when there's excess load on the grid, and
Got
so
it.
you're soaking up the waste that would have otherwise been run into a ground. And so, anyways, going back to that, you have 500 to a gigawatt Bitcoin mines setting up, and they're setting up next to towns that are, consuming 50 megawatts on peak. And so
Mm,
what's really interesting about, the way that we did it is 6 megawatts into a 400 megawatt system could play really nicely and we could consume waste in a way that made a lot of sense. But then you get these systems that are ginormous compared to the relative load demand of a region, and they basically don't have any way of playing.
mm.
And so that's I think, a really good example of load scaling until it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, because you can't scale any longer, and you're all competing for the same energy, right?
Exactly.
Got it.
And, on a very practical cost basis, I would sacrifice 20% of my time, but I would get energy at sub 3 cents a kilowatt. Whereas the 24/7 miners were paying like 5 to 6 cents.
But you're paying less because you're ensuring that you're not doing it when it's peak load,
Yeah.
basically. Got it.
Yeah. So that was kind of the basis behind the idea and what we did. And it was a long process. I think, the early days of Bitcoin mining, it was honestly difficult to even have a conversation with a utility.
Mm,
Like a lot of the mines that I worked for before, I started pitching this idea to utilities were like operations that were underground and like
mhm,
disguised as a different business. And
mhm,
I
mhm.
don't think that's one thing that a lot of people recognize about the early days of Bitcoin is that everyone who did it was kind of treated like a criminal.
Yeah, interesting.
And so there's been a lot of progression in that. That's really cool to see like the zeitgeist of how that's changed.
Mhm,
And another thing that I don't think people realize is utilities are mandated to basically, you go to them and you say, I need load. They say, okay. And so you basically say jump and they say how high and they make it happen. And
Mm-hmm.
it's actually insanely difficult to go to them and say, listen, I want to do exactly what you want
Yeah.
because the way their mandates are structured, it's actually counter to the way that they operate. And so that was a long process.
That's that's interesting.
It
So they're
is.
incentivized just to sell load, but not to negotiate for better prices for someone who's taking that load at an optimal time for the grid, right?
Basically, I mean, I think a better way of saying it might be that their mandate to deliver power no matter what trumps a client coming to them and saying, "Hey, I would like to do exactly what you want. Tell me where you want me, tell me how much you want, tell me when you want it." Those are actually really hard conversations to have with ISOs and utilities, and I think that's also changing. I think what would be really good is if ISOs are basically the facilitator that sits above utilities that distributes energy. If they created a program that said, here's a specific block of energy, this is how we want it consumed, and then just put it to the public, I think that would be a much better system than what exists. But to my knowledge, that basically doesn't exist right now. So
Interesting. Interesting. Well, it's very cool what you did. How did this translate? So lead us up from when you're doing this to bridge it to where you are today.
sure. So, like setting up any new business is a tremendous amount of time, and Bitcoin mining on the front end is an unbelievable amount of work. But it's also kind of awesome in that once you get systems in place, I mean, there's a tremendous degree of maintenance. But we finally did get to the point where our systems were pretty smooth, and we had really good employees, and that finally gave me kind of enough time to prod at Bitcoin intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
And, before that moment, it was basically a day job. I just did it because it made money.
Mm-hmm.
But I really didn't attempt to attack it intellectually until I had a bunch of time to think about it. And
Okay.
once I did, I started to realize, wow, this is actually way more important than what I think people realize. And I spent a long time, like the first 5 years of being in Bitcoin mining, I was basically trying to understand what would kill it from a very
Mm,
practical perspective. I wanted to know, can I keep doing this? And kind of concluded that it's virtually unkillable. And that was a pretty cool process of discovery. And then kind of went down the rabbit hole of, well, money is a distinctly human phenomenon, and it's effectively a cooperation mechanism that allows us to scale trust. And
mm-hmm.
so without money, we have to rely on what's called like altruism. And
Yep.
so kin altruism is helping your family, and then reciprocal altruism is just you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that basically scales to about 150. So before we had money, we basically were limited to small tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And money has allowed us to scale civilization. And I think that
Yeah.
that is the foundational technology for that. And I also think it's the reason why our version of humans lived. It seems like we are the only species of humanoids that use money. And
Mm-hmm.
that's probably why we had our competitive advantage and why we exist today. And so to massively skip to the end, if we perfect money, it's basically a once in a species accomplishment. And it is a substantial reason why we were successful as a species and is very instrumental in who we are.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's an amazing innovation, and it very much also helps you scale trust, and then the process of making money helps you measure how well you're servicing your customers, right? Which is
Yeah.
another means of scaling human progress. And I think we have a whole podcast about that. I do want to dive into a little bit more here, but let's take a step back first to Bitcoin. And you said it's unkillable. Now, I mentioned before we got on the pod that I have a lot to learn about the crypto market, cryptocurrency. One of the things we've heard over many years now is that there's some way that Bitcoin was built that has structural scaling problems, is what we've heard, to people like me who don't know otherwise. And so I told you I had invested in Ethereum because I was told, hey, Ethereum doesn't have those scaling issues. So why don't we let's dive deeper into Bitcoin. And I've seen, despite all that talk about it doesn't scale, the market cap just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. What does the market know that us neophytes don't know? That you're not a neophyte, I am, and why can't it be killed?
Yeah. So the easiest way of explaining why Bitcoin is built the way that it is when you're building a base layer system. So from like a system architect perspective, like the way that the internet works is you have a very robust and simple base layer. It can basically do like two things. And so it's really, really lean. It's really simple. And that's just the process that allows packet switching. And once you have the process of packet switching, you build systems on top of that to add complexity and functionality. But the issue with adding all the functionality at the base layer is it actually attacks security, it
Hmm.
attacks efficiency, it attacks pretty much everything that you want to be robust and packaged on a base layer. And so the notion of saying that, Bitcoin can't scale because it's a base layer technology that's lean and efficient, it's kind of like a false sales pitch.
Hmm.
It's actually really what you want. And if you want to do other things, no reason you can't build it on top of it.
It's interesting because I want and I'm trying to remember, and I hope I maybe I'm remembering wrong. The marketing was that that was out there was that wasn't necessarily lean, that it couldn't scale, right? Do you think that was just potentially other coins trying to spread a narrative that it doesn't scale so they can, obviously compete more effectively?
I think there's two things going on. So the first thing is that, yeah, I mean, I do genuinely believe that there was bias. Like the Ethereum ecosystem self issued, I think it was either 40 or 60% of their tokens to themselves and then sold the rest to the world and has constantly been selling off. And a lot of these projects do that. So in a way it's marketing, but also in a way I don't think it's necessarily nefarious intent because in the early days, well, first of all, I've spent all my time trying to understand Bitcoin and I can confidently say that it took me 10 years to really like wrap my head around it in a way where I feel like I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I understood. That's good.
And the space wasn't 10 years old when this popped up. And so you have to do a lot of work to really understand why things were done the way that they were in Bitcoin. So before you have that knowledge, there is a degree of ego that says, well, it would be nice if it could do this, this, and this. But that's then later followed by, it was done that way for that reason.
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
But it's by making it the most fundamental component of it just does that one thing really, really well. And 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 because of that, it can be the structural foundation of what a whole bunch of other things can be built upon. I almost think of it like an open source ecosystem, right? Where, hey, we do this really well. Hey, other application developers, build on our foundation,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I think, part of that equation is that the space was kind of searching, it was a solution searching for a problem for a while where,
Hmm.
and I think you can see that with Ethereum. I mean, it had a ton of narrative shifts and a lot of changes over the year to adopt perceived value. But it kind of turns out that probably the best use of this technology is creating the best form of money.
Hmm.
And probably the best form of money is something that is controlled by no one and is
Hmm.
representative of everyone.
Hmm.
And I think that's ultimately why Bitcoin is so special is it's accomplished that.
Yep. Interesting, very interesting. So you spent 10 years studying Bitcoin and developing your ideas on and testing your ideas on why it's special. Tell us a little bit more about BTC management as well as your consulting firm and I know you're writing a book on Bitcoin, which I think we're already touching on some of those ideas. Kind of bring it all together about what does this, what do you do now, and how are you taking all the things you've learned to benefit your clients, whether they're being investors or people you're advising.
Sure. So at the end of the day, I'm trying to help people understand Bitcoin first and foremost.
Hmm.
And so I'm doing whatever I can. I try to meet people where they're at, have conversations, and really just get it out there that hey, this matters a lot. And then you need to be paying attention to this.
Yep.
And that's what the consulting firm's there for. There's a
Hmm.
lot of people in the space who, want to DIY, myself included. So I
Hmm.
made tons of mistakes along the way, unfortunately, as we all did, quite frankly. But there is that desire to be in control and do it. And so the consulting firm really emphasizes that while also trying to say, hey, look, here's a bit of experiential wisdom. Maybe consider doing it like this and kind of working through strategies with people and hopefully avoiding mistakes along the way. And the hedge fund very simply just copies my trading strategy.
Mm.
Trading strategy is I've got a pretty simple thesis where, in my opinion, roughly 3 out of 100 people who own Bitcoin deeply understand it. And so when you lack deep understanding of what you own, you're prone to emotion, and
Mm.
volatility drives emotion. And so I have basically taken the opposite side of volatility. And that has been a very good strategy as it relates to Bitcoin.
So essentially, the people may be selling when they shouldn't be selling or buying when they shouldn't be buying,
Yeah,
and you're able to play the other side of the trade.
exactly.
Hey, that's a strategy that's as old as hedge funds itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not a novel concept by any stretch of the imagination, but it is, somewhat difficult to execute without the knowledge. And so that's sorry, go on.
No, no, no. Sorry, go on. Continue, please. I'm just in my brain. There's a whole bunch of questions firing off
Sure.
that are interesting to me. So I apologize. This is because I'm excited about what you're saying.
Well, doing this has been substantially financially more financially beneficial than mining. Mining is a very low margin business. We had a good system. It worked great, but decided to sell it and focus on the hedge fund and also consulting and getting the word out. And I think, when the mining space was nascent, a lot of my activities that I was doing was very forward looking. And I feel like I've played my part in bringing that space forward. And I feel like this is where I need to be now. So,
Understood. So I'm thinking about Bitcoin as the ultimate trust currency, right? But there are differences in there's a lot of differences, but from the standpoint of one I can see immediately different from the perspective of kind of the speculation around Bitcoin's value is very different, I believe. I could be wrong. The speculation about the dollar value, right? Like the value of the dollar, is probably a lot more tied to interest rates, productivity of the US economy, a variety of complex things that makes it probably a bit more stable, right? People aren't necessarily investing in the US dollar, right, to get high returns in on their money, unless you're a hedge fund in some way, shape, or form who's levering up on things, right, to capture that value. Bitcoin is inherently different, and so we hear things like about stable coins. I hear talk about stable coins all the time because Bitcoin's rise and up and down in valuation. It's viewed as not stable. Tell me a little. I mean, that it not being stable is good from an investment standpoint. How does that also play into it being what we hope is the best currency in the world
sure.
ever in the history of humanity?
Yeah. And it's worth kind of making some very subtle definitions, I think. And so
Definitely.
I think, currency is a different thing than money. And currency is, something that's relatively stable, probably managed, easy to transmit, but also is a melting ice cube in the sense that the people who control it print it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
you're guaranteed to lose, right? Money is the best energy battery for your currency. So when you want to store your economic energy for later, that's what money is. And there's been lots of good economic batteries, real estate, gold, there's much better things to store your economic energy into than currency.
Yeah. Than the US dollar or the peso or whatever it may be. Right.
Exactly. And so there's effectively a certain portion of the market that is high, throughput and lots of transactions. And that's the consumption side of the economy. And there's the other side of the economy that's seeking the best economic battery. And this side of the spectrum is what I think Bitcoin is competing for. I think it is the best energy battery for economic energy battery that exists.
Got it. Got it. To store that value. And yeah, if you are the best battery for that, it makes sense that it should go up over time, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, so essentially the stable coins are not trying to be that battery. They're trying to be the currency of the crypto world. Whereas Bitcoin is trying to be the battery. That makes sense to me. So there's a lot of probably hedge funds out there that are trading in various cryptocurrencies. Probably some of them kind of operate like a traditional hedge fund manager who has a basket of stocks. They're probably investing in a basket of crypto coins, right? It sounds to me you're only trading in Bitcoin, right?
That's correct.
And there's probably others that only trade in Bitcoin too. What staying away from the topic completely of anything regarding investment returns or anything like that. What's the fundamental different strategy that you may be employing or looking at it than other potentially sophisticated hedge fund managers that are only looking and trading in Bitcoin?
Yeah. In a very simple way of explaining it without going into a ton of detail,
Yeah,
it's effectively a carry trade against currency.
got it.
And so, like every real estate empire was built off that, right? You take a loan and invest in an asset that appreciates more than your debt required. There you go. It's a carry trade shorting the dollar.
Mm.
And that's basically what our fund does. So
Interesting. Very, very cool. So obviously as the world, AI is kind of the biggest new thing in the world over the last few years, right? Is there any effect that the AI revolution is having on cryptocurrency and that crypto in general? And then separately from that on Bitcoin, and last but not least on how you operate your company
sure.
and your investment strategy.
So we'll start with the broader crypto market. I don't have a ton to say, but one of the things that I think has been really interesting is that AI has definitely removed the cost of engineering smart attacks.
Mm.
And a lot of DAOs have been hacked since AI, like the security assumptions for Zcash was kind of turned on its head. This is where you're starting to see a lot of these overly complex systems break. And that has been really interesting to me because it's kind of, seeing the lean protocol thesis play out, if you will.
So yeah, if I can paraphrase this, and I'm sure there's a lot I understand. Bitcoin is a lean product, right? A lot of the other crypto are based on much more complex, like business cases, like, hey, we're the application layer of this, that, or the other thing, or we're the in video game currency across different video game worlds, whatever. I've seen so many different ideas. So you're basically saying that crypto, which is supposed to be trustless, but ultimately the goal is it needs to ensure trust, right? Some of these platforms are easily broken,
Yeah.
and I cannot be trusted. Did I understand what you were trying to get at?
Yeah, and this might not be the most professional way of saying it, but a lot of the arguments of the people who created this was leaning on more like, trust me, bro, like we did it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
some of these things are starting to fall apart. And I like, for example, the Zcash thing. I almost hate to attack them because I think they've done some really cool stuff over there. It's been an amazing science experiment, and there's been a lot of innovation there, and it's been really cool. So it's not all bad, but it's not your economic battery.
Mhm.
It's a completely
Mhm.
different thing. So apples and oranges, I
It's
guess.
w
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why I have invested in crypto more is because I don't understand it, right? And I kinda knew it was the wild, wild west out there, and you may get some big winners if you invest in some smaller coins, but you can also get some really big losers as well. And so, kind of I viewed it as, and this is not saying that this is a good strategy, viewers, but if I was gonna invest, I was gonna invest in the well-known names that have been, tested a bit more, right?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is AI has empowered algorithms that have been able to break a lot of these blockchains per
Yeah.
se more. Okay. So how does what has been AI's effect on Bitcoin? To go to my second question.
Sure. Well, in all fairness, like when you start adding complexity on top of Bitcoin, you do it in layers, right? So layer
Mhm.
twos and layer threes. I've seen some of those systems break as well. So, but what's nice about that is the base layer is still safe.
Mhm.
So, kind of a smart way of building things, right?
So what makes the base layer of Bitcoin so safe?
Because it is so lean. It can only do a few things. And it's also, delegated by nodes and node operators. Like one example that I think's worth highlighting that I don't know if people know about, but relatively early on in Bitcoin's history, there was an inflation bug where a lot of Bitcoin got into existence. It's like billions of Bitcoin. And the network really quickly was like, no, we can't allow that. And everyone basically agreed that we got to change that. And we reached consensus very quickly. And so there's a human element of leaning on the node system being the ultimate arbiter, where if things do break, like if there is a nefarious government who does whatever, it's ultimately representative of everyone who uses Bitcoin. And
Mhm.
that's really, really powerful. And that's another thing that's really important. Like the kind of the opposite end of that is Ethereum, for example. I'm sure you heard of their DAO hack, where a lot of their coins that were assigned, a lot of people didn't really like the idea that they got to change the chain back.
Mm.
And there's a pretty good example of a small organization saying, no, this is for the better of all of everyone. This is what we're doing. And that's a small organization controlling monetary policy. And Bitcoin is everyone controlling monetary policy. And
So it is definitely more of a engine built on supply and demand of the people participating in its economy.
yeah, and it's why it's so resilient. Like if there was, let's just say, a nefarious government attack on Bitcoin that somehow succeeded, I guarantee you the network's not going to say, yeah, let's go along with North Korea coin or whatever. Let's change that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. S- So now let's tie it back to you. Do you use AI in any way, shape, or form to help you conduct your investment research?
I do. So, admittedly, I wrote a thesis, and it took me about 4 years. And that thesis was drawn on tons of sources. And I've effectively created a library of all the information I ingested to help me create the thesis. And that's been a useful library. And I've basically thrown. Well, let me take a step back. So it used to be you could consume everything in Bitcoin. I mean, it was no problem because there were so few people in the space. And just now you can't, even if you try, you're literally limited by, physics at this point. You can't do it. So
Mhm.
I made a Claude bot that basically analyzes and transcribes all new videos against my existing database and
Mm,
says, hey, this is an idea you haven't thought about yet,
mm.
and that helps me narrow in. And I spend 3 or 4 hours every day just synthesizing new ideas, and it could be way more than that if I didn't have my Cloudbot running in the background helping me sift through everything.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that's been really useful. And I also, I'm decently technically competent, but at the same time, I would consider myself to be more of a hacker. I've always just figured out exactly what I needed.
Hmm.
And it's still allowed me to build some very sophisticated systems for modeling price and behavior.
Mm,
And that's been really helpful. Like I have my own version of the greed and fear index that I think is a
mm,
little bit better
yep,
and at least more useful from my perspective, right?
yep, yep.
So those are kind of the two ways I've really leaned on AI.
Not. I'm hesitating to say this, but how do I say is there's a big portion of the crypto market that has unsophisticated investors, and probably the greed and fear index and your own version of it is it's understand there's money to be made. We'll leave it at that. you know,
There's
Go on.
When there is lack of knowledge, there are, I don't want to say a lot because I need to be very precise because the truth is I don't make a ton of trades.
Yep.
Like I think if you looked at most hedge funds, you would see a lot more activity. But when a space is so dislocated from a knowledge perspective, there's really asymmetric opportunities that do happen.
Hmm.
Kind of my strategy is to wait until they happen and then take action, and definitely don't try to predict it because again, when most people don't know what the heck's going on, you can't predict that. So
Well, coming from the hedge fund world, specifically a quantitative hedge fund world, trading costs can really derail a strategy. I'm assuming that probably similar for a crypto hedge fund. Am I right?
I'm sure, and I'm sure that also hits like the high frequency guides pretty hard.
Yeah.
But admittedly, because I'm doing like long duration carry trades at very precise moments, there's the cost of debt. And
Hmm.
you do pay a little bit when you execute, but it's not so substantial from where I'm sitting, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. So tell me about your consulting company. And I know you want to educate people on Bitcoin. And you're advising people. Other than advising and educating them, just tell us what your typical client is there and why they're coming to you to help them.
Sure. So I think the best way I can describe it is that going back to money being the base layer technology for civilization, that basically makes money a very human thing that kind of touches everything. And so, because of that, has permeated into many facets of life. And because of that, it means different things to different people. And
Hmm.
so what I end up doing most of the time is trying to meet people that where they're at on the way that they view money and kind of reverse engineer from there. And that's kind of my process of consulting people and then helping them see what Bitcoin is.
Got it.
And frankly, it's a wide spectrum and everybody's different. And I just try to meet people where they are.
Got it. It doesn't act like you're not acting like a wealth manager there. It's more just consulting and educating. Correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Got it.
And I will give strategic recommendations. I mean, admittedly, since Bitcoin's a commodity, I can legally say you should buy some Bitcoin, right?
Yeah. Understood. Understood. Yeah.
It's a different story when it's the ETFs and
Yeah.
stuff, but I genuinely recommend everyone own Bitcoin. Like
Yeah.
don't give it to other people. So there's no conflict there for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the hedge fund really is just a vehicle that copies what I've been doing for myself. It's the way I treat my money. And if anyone wants to hop in and kind of cognitively offload that burden, then I'm doing
Yep.
it for me. Other people can hop in too. Whereas the consulting firm is really trying to help people get on the right track for the long journey that is understanding Bitcoin.
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. So we're coming close to the end of our podcast. I want to touch on your book. I'm assuming that your book has a lot to do with what we've talked today about the nature of Bitcoin, but tell us more, and when do you predict the book will be finished?
Sure.
I'm
So
ready.
quick plug. So the thesis itself is something that I completed not too long ago. It was a 4-year project. It's very dry and matter of fact, and will probably put people to sleep. But it's a great resource if you want to plow through it. And anyone who wants a copy can get it. Just kind of reach out,
Yeah. Yep.
But the idea of the next book, it's called Money Makes Us Human. and it talks about the human dynamics and what makes good money. And they're, looking back at history, it appears that civilizations flourish when good money is the base layer for cooperation. And it seems like it goes the other direction when bad money is the base layer of cooperation. And the book is trying to turn the historical context of that into more of a narrative that
Yeah, I've heard throughout my life, I've heard from many people, money is the root of all evil. I'm very much a firm proponent that the opposite is true. And but some people they're going to die on that hill despite all the empirical evidence otherwise, right?
yeah, well, I think it's actually really important to look at it both ways because
Okay.
there is truth in that. And there is
Mhm.
also truth that money is what allowed humanity to scale cooperation, and
Mhm.
cooperation is the reason we're a successful species.
Yep.
And both of those statements can be true. And I really do believe that the difference between the two is, was it good money or was it bad money?
Yeah, that's why I knew that's what you were going to say. Yeah, it's true. It's
Yeah.
true. So give me the example of what bad money is.
It's money that a small group of people can control.
Yep. Mm.
That is the basis of all bad money. I think money is meant to be a neutral instrument. It's meant to not be something that can be politically influenced. I think the best form of money is something that's neutral.
I would say broadening it out beyond just money, centralized power,
Yeah.
right, is the root. But you say the root of all evil. I'll kind of go into a different sphere. Lord Acton, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You bring that to the sphere of money when you have a small group of people who control current money, the money supply, and they can make the decisions for everybody. Do you think they're going to make decisions that are the benefit for everybody or for a small group? It's a story as old as time, my friend.
It is. Yeah. And it's so funny because, I mean, it's been a repeating pattern and it's a really interesting thing to go back and look at in the context of history. But it's also kind of fascinating to realize, holy cow, we might be finally passing that gap in this thing called Bitcoin. And
Of course, governments are going to fight it tooth and nail because it decentralizes their power.
as hard as they can, and they're going to have to adapt. I mean,
Yeah.
I hate to sound cocky, but like they don't really have a choice with this thing.
I was really scared, I don't know, a couple years ago when there was a lot of talk from the Biden administration about, the government issuing a centralized cryptocurrency that would be, I don't want to butcher it, but from my perception, it was going to be the only approved cryptocurrency and that they were going to regulate everything else away so it couldn't compete. Was my perception true of what they were trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, this will be tried. It's already been tried. They'll keep trying. And
Hmm.
in many ways, they will succeed. But ultimately, the thing that's interesting to me is that you can't stop Bitcoin. You can only cut yourself off from it. And
Yep.
so when you're trying to cut your citizens off from a tool that's practically unenforceable, it basically makes the compliant part of your population less empowered. And so
Hmm.
it's like stabbing yourself in a way, and it's not a good strategy. And many countries will do it, but it won't work.
Yep. Yep. It's, you know, from a philosophical standpoint, when done right, I'm a pro-capitalist because capitalism in its purest form is supply and demand, distribution of decisions across everybody that's part of the market. Obviously, you need to have some sort of government in there for various reasons, right? To so people respect capitalism and follow the rules of capitalism. Don't centralize power, whether it's money or something else. But I think it's a lesson that I try to get out there that we need to be the as individuals we need to be the masters of our own destiny and be respected to make decisions for ourselves, and it sounds like Bitcoin from a money perspective is the purest way of achieving that. So
100%. And I would argue most of the deep Bitcoin thinkers that I know are very aligned to what you just described.
yep.
I think they're, lean protocol thesis, lean government thesis. I think the more complicated a government system gets, the worse off we are. And I think stripping the power of money from governments will probably be a tremendously beneficial. I mean, I heard someone say once, like, civilization was so much better off when there was separation of church and state, and money's the same thing. So
Yeah. Well, you've opened my eyes to this, right? I mean, I obviously in the early days, so I read the book Cryptonomicon long time ago. So and and that was before I'd heard of Bitcoin. I think I was probably published before Bitcoin was created, I think. But the idea of it being started as a counter to centralized power was very intriguing to me, right? And now I actually understand it even more now, having spoken with you. So, what if there's one thing you wanted to leave the audience with about Bitcoin, about you, about your business, what would it be?
I would say that I've had a very interesting life, and by far the most valuable time I've spent while I'm here has been understanding Bitcoin. And I feel very grateful that I've been able to do that and just want to be able to help other people who want it. So
Well, fantastic. Well, I learned a lot today. Yeah, I have a lot of fun when I'm learning, and I hope the audience also learned a lot and enjoyed this podcast with you. Nate, thank you so much for joining Scaling Alpha.
thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for joining. We are very excited to have had Nate here and look forward to you on the next one. All the best.